Okay. Module I believe, right? We're just whizzing through this. I can tell you're all excited about it. Okay. When we talk about ventilatory support, we can look at it from two different angles. One of which is that it's taking all the work away. So all the effort the patient would need to do, if any, is to trigger the breath to start. Beyond that, the ventilator does everything. And it's basically where we're providing all the alveolar minute ventilation that would be necessary to support life. Let's check something here. I guess it's working. On the other end of the spectrum is partial ventilatory support, where we're doing some but not all. Okay? In that case, the patient has to contribute some component to the alveolar ventilation, the process. We're going to call this combination of control variables, phase variables, conditional variables, other settings, a mode. And each mode is basically how that ventilator interacts with the patient to deliver a breath. We'll find that there is, amongst manufacturers, the newest and greatest thing, and you have to buy it for your ventilator or else you're a total loser, right? A lot of times it's exactly the same thing. It's been around for 20 years. You just market it under a different name. Okay, so it really doesn't make a whole lot of difference. Before I forget, pass these out. This is an old pamphlet, but it actually still explains quite well the concept of flow triggering and how flow triggering works.
Do we get to keep these then?
Huh?
Do we get to keep these?
Sure.
Okay.
I get them for free. You can have them. So a lot of times when you hear, when you go to trade shows or you go and you get the new application for ventilation, a lot of times it's nothing new. It's just repackaged information. So when we talk about a mode, we're going to look at, first of all, how is it controlled? Is it a pressure-oriented breath? Is it a volume-oriented breath? Or is it something we're going to call dual-controlled, and I'll explain that in 2 seconds. We talked about set point, where you just set the number and it goes ahead and delivers it. Dual point's going to be a little bit, or dual control's going to be a little bit different, as is servo-controlled. Is the breath that is being delivered a mandatory breath, or does it have the ability to have spontaneous breath, or a combination of the two? Each mode is going to be a little bit different as far as whether or not they allow that. Those phase variables, what triggers, what cycles, what limits, what goes on during the expiratory phase, all of those we can quantify. And if it does allow spontaneous breaths, are those spontaneous breaths supported with some mechanism to boost the tidal volume, similar to what we did with the delta in non-invasive ventilation? If there's any conditional variables, what are those, and what other settings could be set up? So let me first of all talk about this concept of dual control ventilation, because 2 of the 3 ventilators that we're going to look at, the Siemens Servo I and the Draeger XL, did the XL? Yeah. It didn't sound right for a second there. Both use dual controlled ventilation as opposed to just strict volume-oriented breaths. First of all, there's only one thing you can control at a time. I can either have a pressure-oriented breath where pressure is controlled, pressure is kept constant, volume and flow are variable, or I can have a volume-controlled breath where volume is the thing that's being controlled, and along with flow, because it's an integral of the volume, and pressure becomes the variable that changes on a breath-by-breath basis based upon compliance, resistance, and flow characteristics. With dual control ventilation, they kind of went a little bit fancy. It's typically set up as a pressure-oriented breath that is being delivered, So it's a pressure-controlled breath, but it looks at the volume that was delivered with that breath and changes the pressure level on a subsequent breath, either up or down, to get to my targeted tidal volume. Do I need to say that again? Okay. Let's say I'm putting Stacy on a ventilator, and I want to target her tidal volume of 600 milliliters. Okay. The ventilator will go ahead and deliver a pressure-oriented breath. In a pressure-oriented breath, what's variable? Volume and flow rate. So the flow characteristics are totally dependent upon her desires, and the volume is based upon her lung compliance and airway resistance. Okay. I'm targeting 600, but she's delivering 550. So what the ventilator does is it takes the pressure control level and bumps it up a little bit, and then sees what happens. If it's still not back to 600, it bumps it up a little bit more. If it's at 600, it's fine. And every breath it looks at the previous one and raises or lowers the pressure control level to target my tidal volume. So it was a way to be able to accomplish volume ventilation with a fixed, quote-unquote, tidal volume, but still have variable flow rates that the patient can attain. Okay? It sounds like it's the best of both worlds. There's a caveat to it, and we'll talk about it another time. It's not, I mean, like everything else, it's got lots of goods, but there's a real big bad that's associated there too, typically if the clinician's not paying attention. Okay. These are used for mandatory breaths. So every time the patient triggers the breath on, it's going to go ahead and deliver a pressure-oriented breath, monitoring the volume that has been delivered and altering that pressure level in subsequent breath. On the Draeger, this is what happens when we turn on autoflow. And we'll walk through this as we go. On the Servo I, it's called PRVC, which stands for Pressure Regulated Volume Control. It's kind of a misnomer because it's really not a volume control breath. You're not controlling volume, you're controlling pressure. But that was their fancy way of marketing it. On the 840, it's called VC Plus, Volume Control Plus. And we'll show you how to access those. And we won't concern ourselves too in depth or at all, really. But we can do the same thing with a spontaneous breath, where we alter the pressure support level. But I'll hold off on that. Make sense so far? So I can have a volume-oriented breath, a pressure-oriented breath, or kind of a hybrid between the two, where it's really down and dirty. It's a pressure-based breath, but it's going to alter. The software itself will automatically alter the pressure control level to get to my targeted tidal volume.
Are we able to, oh, sorry.
Go ahead. Go ahead, Stacy.
I was just gonna ask, can we mimic this in the lab so we can see?
Absolutely.
Okay.
Absolutely. Brittany.
Okay, so just so that I understand.
I doubt it.
Yeah, probably not, but I'm gonna try it anyway.
Alrighty.
So pressure is what's controlled, but the pressure is adjusted to attain a particular volume.
On a subsequent breath. That's the important thing to remember. It always has to deliver one breath to see where it's at, and then it changes it on the next breath.
What about the alarms, like if it gives you, you don't get your targeted tidal volume, increase the pressure on the next breath, are there alarm limits with that too?
Yep.
Okay, there may be a problem.
And it could be a problem if you don't set your alarms correctly. You can actually get to the point where the ventilator won't increase it any further.
Well, that would be a problem if you don't set your alarms properly, or if you don't set your alarms properly, the pressures can get totally out of control.
That is true too.
Cause a lot of problems with the pressures being high to achieve that tidal volume if the lungs are
Well,
stiff.
when we go into the lab, we'll set these ventilators up so that you can see what ends up happening as you change compliance and resistance. You can see the pressure levels changing in the process. Okay, so that's dual control. Spontaneous and mandatory, as we talked about before. A mandatory breath is always started either by the patient or the machine, but it's always ended by the machine. Something is monitored by the machine that cycles the breath off. With a spontaneous breath, it's started and ended by the machine. That's the by the patient, excuse me. That's a distinction between the two. So we can have just mandatory, just spontaneous, or a mixture of the two. In a spontaneous mode, again, this is where the patient is doing everything. All the volume that is delivered is determined by the compliance and resistance. The rate that they do is whatever they want. Their inspiratory time is whatever they want. The ventilator is just there, assisting them perhaps. The only time you would see a mandatory breath occur during a spontaneous mode is if the patient went apneic. So if I had a patient who was perhaps a drug overdose, and they're breathing spontaneously, but periodically they just stop breathing. Well, it kind of would be nice for the ventilator to recognize that, alarm, and kick into an apnea ventilation until they started breathing again. Don't want the patient to get hypercarbic, acidotic, go into cardiac arrest. Call me silly, but that probably would not be good. Okay? The other reason that you would have a mandatory breath is if you, the clinician standing at the bedside, push the manual breath button. And all the ventilators have a manual breath where you can give them a breath now. And sometimes nursing will use that when they're suctioning the patient. They'll turn them up to 100%, give them a couple deep breaths with the manual breath button, and then go ahead and suction. So it's a way to hyperoxygenate, hyperinflate.
So with the manual breath, as long as you hold that button down,
No.
that's how long? Or
No.
it is a fixed
Yeah. It's,
time?
it's a fixed volume, fixed inspiratory flow rate that you set up to begin with.
So it's not like you sit there and go, okay.
No, but there's another button you can press that will do that.
Okay.
But most of them will recognize if the patient is trying to take a breath and say, hello, let the patient breathe. Okay, so we call this mode on most ventilators either CPAP or spontaneous. And by saying spontaneous, obviously, they're all spontaneous breaths. Okay. Some ventilators, it's called CPAP, just that is in the sense that there may or may not be an elevated baseline. But those breaths are all pressure controlled. So the pressure is what is, we're monitoring the amount of baseline pressure that they end up having. They're basically breathing around a baseline. As they inspire, it goes down to a negative pressure. Exhalation becomes a positive pressure, but it's pressure control. We're the ones that are setting how much this baseline pressure is. It is a spontaneous breath in the sense that the patient starts it and the patient stops it. They're in control of the breath. They're going to trigger and open up the valve either by generating a certain amount of flow or by creating a certain amount of negative pressure. That's what's going to open up the system to allow them to gain gas. But they have to do it. No one else will. Because it's pressure controlled, it's also pressure limited. There's a maximum pressure that this is going to oscillate around. That's what we set. And we'll talk about the cycling mechanism in a half a second when I talk about pressure support. Key part is the patient determines everything involved. What their rate is, what their tidal volume is, what their inspiratory time is, all of that's determined by the patient. The ventilator, in a sense, is just sitting there. If you want to think of it, you guys all know what a T-piece setup is, right? Where you hook up an aerosol and they're breathing spontaneously. It's an electronic T-piece. It's basically just allowing them to access a gas source. And if, we set the FiO2 and whatever they want to breathe, they breathe. The beauty of it is I have alarms and I have apnea parameters. So if they stop, I got some backup. Put them on a T-piece and they stop breathing. Oh well. Nice knowing you. Not much you can do there. Concept makes sense. That's spontaneous, or CPAP. So again, negative pressure on inspiration, positive pressure on exhalation. So as they breathe in, this is inspiratory flow, this is expiratory flow. Gas goes in, gas comes back out again. Pretty straightforward. And I can, in this case, I have basically 5, I have 0, I take that back. 10, 20, 30, yep, this is at 0. So there's no baseline pressure there. Zeep, if you will. And again, this is just another picture of a spontaneous breath, inspired exhalation. Inhalation at A, exhalation at B. Everybody see that? Okay. Patient breathing in and out. And all I've done here is create an elevation of baseline pressure, 10, 20, 30, so that's probably a CPAP of 5. Pushing the stupid button. I have a new toy, so I'm playing with it here. Good? Now, obviously, to put them in a spontaneous mode, they have to be able to spontaneously breathe. Seems like an obvious thing, but I've had physicians say, can we do a weaning trial on this person by putting him in spontaneous? And it's like, no, because you have him on a paralytic. Probably not a good idea, okay? The good part about it is, yeah, it allows the patient to regulate their own PaCO2. I'm not doing anything to control their CO2. They're going to be able to do it. I can control oxygenation by altering the baseline pressure, or the FiO2, but their CO2 is going to be able to be controlled by them. And always, 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 the ventilator should have some apnea ventilation available. So one of the things you're going to set up, when you set up the ventilators, you're going to set apnea parameters. And basically, they're just whatever you would have in assist control. When we get to that part, you're going to set them up as apnea parameters. So again, what the order would look like would be something along this line. Physician writes an order for CPAP of 5. I place the patient into either the spontaneous mode or the CPAP, depending upon the ventilator. We'll see that as we go through the 3 of them. Set our FiO2 to what is desired. Set my CPAP level to what is desired. So I'm going to set the baseline pressure to wherever I want it. And then I'm going to adjust my sensitivity. Usually it's either flow or pressure. Those are the 2 most common types of sensitivity that allows the patient to trigger the ventilator valve open to access that spontaneous gas source. Set my apnea parameters, set my alarms based upon what the patient is doing. Now you won't be able to set up the alarms until you hook the patient up. Everything up to this point in time I can do before ever hooking them up. I can't set my alarms until I know what they're doing. So it's going to be kind of the last step. And then just monitor the patient as far as what they're doing, inspiratory time, expiratory flow rate, tidal volume frequency, whatever. Make sense? Sure, Rick, whatever you say. Now, let's say I go ahead and put Stacy on the spontaneous mode. And I determine that her spontaneous tidal volume is running about 200 milliliters. Not knowing Stacy's height off the top of my head, I want to make a bet that 200 is not within that 5 to 8 milliliters per kilogram of ideal body weight. Just call me silly, okay? So that means that her spontaneous tidal volume is probably not going to be adequate enough to control her CO2 effectively. I can go back to full support, or I can just add a little boost. Just like we did in BiPAP by making that delta bigger, I can augment her spontaneous tidal volume using something called pressure support. Remember when this first came out, I remember one of the docs talking about it sounded like some kind of a legal thing where you we're forcing them to pay child support. Pressure support. He thought it was an odd name. So, under normal conditions, what determines the spontaneous tidal volume is typically the compliance and the resistance. Compliance goes down, spontaneous tidal volume goes down. Area resistance goes up, spontaneous tidal volume goes down. Okay. So in the face of low compliance or high area resistance, that spontaneous tidal volume may not be adequate to sustain life. So what we do is we augment it and get more volume for the same amount of effort on the part of the patient. This is a spontaneous breath. The ventilator is not controlling the breath, the patient is. It's an important concept to remember. And there's lots of reasons why we may need to do this. Perhaps when they were intubated, they put the wrong size tube in. It's too small. They're having a hard time breathing through that straw. Maybe they have some asthmatic conditions that are preventing them, and it's not something enough to put them back on full support, but I want to be able to overcome that resistance or problems with compliance or just bad lungs in the process.
Wait, I'm sorry, I missed something here. A major point. How are we giving them more volume boost? Is that what
We're using a increase in delta to augment their spontaneous tidal volume. Just like we did in BiPAP, but this is a little bit different. Okay. Two ways we do this. One, we're going to call pressure support ventilation. Pressure support. And there's another application of it that I'll talk about. It's kind of pressure support, but we're not setting the pressure level. That didn't come out right. So let me talk about pressure support first. Easy way to concept it. This is nothing more than establishing a delta pressure. If let's say I'm on CPAP or spontaneous, and I have that set at 5 centimeters of water pressure for Stacy, and I notice that small tidal volume, I can say, let's go ahead and boost that tidal volume by adding 10 centimeters of water of pressure support. So every time she spontaneously triggers, opens up the valve, the airways pressurize by 10 centimeters of water above my baseline of 5. So I'm starting out here at 5, and when she triggers the breath on, it pressurizes to 15. So my delta is 10. And then when she's done with the breath, it ends. Okay. Here's the difference between this and what we did in BiPAP. In BiPAP, what parameters do I set? IPAP and EPAP. I set this pressure and I set that pressure. Pressure support, we set the baseline and we set how much above that baseline we want to boost it. So we're really setting the delta. In IPAP and EPAP, it determines the delta, but here we're actually setting it. It's a little bit of a nuance that is there.
Sounds like the same thing.
It's exactly the same thing. It's just how you set it up on the critical care ventilator differs from how you set it up on the non-invasive ventilator. Mechanically, it's the same exact thing. I'm making Stacy's tidal volume bigger. How am I doing that? By pushing a little bit of gas with her spontaneous breath. More pressure, more volume. So if 10 doesn't do it, go to 12. If 10 is too much, it's more than 8 milliliters per kilogram, lower the pressure. Pressure support is a pressure-based breath. What does that mean? Volume and flow are variables. they're going to change when the compliance and the resistance changes. So I put Stacy on 10 of pressure support ventilation. I see her tidal volume come back as 7 milliliters per kilogram ideal body weight. I'm bitching. Everything's cool. 2 hours later, she goes into bronchospasm. Her area resistance now goes up. What's going to happen to her volume that is being generated by her? It's going to go down. It's going to change. The volume is not guaranteed. Boy, it'd be nice to have an alarm on there that tells me, oh, wait a minute, we do. There's a low tidal volume and quite often a high tidal volume alarm that makes sure that we're within that range. So I'm boosting their spontaneous tidal volume to get a bigger tidal volume. And for the most part, it works out pretty fine. It's not the end-all be-all, but pressure support ventilation. It's an augmentation of a spontaneous breath. Pressure support can only work when you have spontaneous breaths available. If all I have is mandatory, it don't work because there's no spontaneous breath to apply it to. Okay. So again, we're talking about a pressure-controlled breath. A pressure-oriented breath. Volume and flow become variable. It is a spontaneous breath. We'll talk about its use interspersed with those mandatory breaths later. Patient's the one that's going to trigger the breath to start it. It rises to a fixed pressure and stays there. So if I were to draw it, here's my pressure tracing. What's fixed? The amount of pressure that's being delivered. If I look at my inspiratory flow, it actually is a flow cycled breath. In IPPB, what ends the breath? What ends the breath? Well, the patient can do it secondarily. But what stops the breath is when it reaches that peak pressure, right? It's a pressure-cycled breath. In this mode, what we end up having is as the inspiratory flow begins to decrease, when it reaches a preset threshold, it shuts off. Think about how a spontaneous breath goes. You guys all have taken an IPB, right? You know that what ended up happening is you got this rush of gas going into your lungs. In a pressure-supported breath, what ends up happening is your lungs are inflated, and as they get more and more inflated, flow rate starts to slow down as you start getting to the periphery. When it gets to a preset point, shuts off and exhalation begins. So what we have is that inspiratory flow is variable. Here's my pressure tracing. Here's my flow tracing. So when the ventilator turns on, it rises, it pressurizes the circuit. There's lots of gas flow available, and it starts to decrease. When it gets to a preset point, it shuts off. So when it first turns on, there's this massive amount of flow that's coming out. As the lungs fill up, it starts slowing down. So the shape of the flow tracing is a decelerating, it's what's called exponential decay. I know you don't like me using that stupid word because it sounds like there's math involved. But the point being is that it's actually kind of a curved shape. It's not something where it's a fixed flow. You cannot program the flow rate the patient generates. It's a spontaneous breath. They're in control. Turn it on, rises to my preset threshold, stays there until the inspiratory flow drops down to a preset point. You betcha. Typically 25%. So if I have, when this thing turns on, here's my square wave flow, or pressure curve rather. Here's my flow rate. If this is 60 liters per minute, when the valve opens, flow comes out at 60 liters per minute, totally dependent upon the patient. It's whatever they want to draw. It'll continue delivering flow until that flow drops down to 25% of that initial peak flow, which would be 15 liters per minute. I did that in my head. So where this ends is at 15. Bottom line is that it's a slower flow than it was initially pressurized within the circuitry. Can I change that 25%? Yes. There's a setting called E-sensitivity, expiratory sensitivity, or termination flow, where you can make an adjustment on that. But I'm not going to talk about that. Depending on the machine. Well, they all have some mechanism, don't they?
Not the XL or the older versions, I think the new one does.
Oh, that's right. That's right. Okay.
What do they call that again? What?
E-sensitivity, expiratory sensitivity. It's the last bullet point. Okay. So a pressure-supported breath is a spontaneous breath that has the tidal volume boosted by applying a small amount of pressure, small amount of delta. It's started by the patient, and it ends when the patient's inspiratory flow rate drops down to a preset threshold. So it's still considered a spontaneous breath because the patient's in control. So this is just showing that cutoff point is based upon whatever the starting one was. It's a certain percentage of the inspiratory flow, of the peak inspiratory flow rate. So how do we set this up? Usually we use this concept here. Just a small amount. 5 to 10 centimeters of water. Overcomes any work of breathing that's associated with the endotracheal tube or ventilator circuit, humidifier, whatever. There is a way that I can say, you know what, I would rather just target a certain tidal volume and boost it and get really high levels. That's typically not used as much anymore. We used to call it PSV max. Now we just use a little bit, just to overcome the resistance of the endotracheal tube. So how do I magically figure this out? Well, I can monitor their tidal volume. Their tidal volume is not where I want, I add some more delta. Their PCO2 is still high, I add some more delta. I can also watch the patient's inspiratory, or their patient's respiratory rate. If I'm making the tidal volume bigger, their respiratory rate should come down. They're breathing 30 times a minute because they're breathing that rapid, shallow pattern, breathing like a spaniel. I go ahead and I make their tidal volume bigger, their rate should come down. This makes logical sense. Okay. So that's typically what we end up doing is that middle one. We watch their inspiratory or their exhale tidal volume. If it's not where we want it, we add a little more support. So how the order will be written is something along this line. Basically place them in the CPAP or spontaneous mode because this is spontaneous breathing. Put my level of CPAP or PEEP to wherever I want it. In this case it'd be 5. Set my desired FiO2. I put pressure support on and adjust that to 5 because that's what the order calls for. And go ahead then and set up my trigger mechanism. Set my apnea parameters. And once I've established what these values are, I can go ahead and set my alarms. Now what should, if I have this set at these settings, what should the pressure in the circuitry be during the inspiratory phase? 10. I'm starting at 5 and going up an additional 5 to a pressure of 10. And you should see that on the ventilator's display, that the pressure, airway pressure is at 10. Okay. Sounds like a great deal, right? Stacy's going to get a bigger tidal volume. Again, it's assuming that compliance and resistance is not changing. What changes in compliance and resistance, all bets are off. It's a pressure-based breath. You need to set your alarm so you're able to monitor that the tidal volume is appropriate. Goes the other direction too. If all of a sudden her lung compliance improves, I could get too big of a tidal volume. And obviously anyone who is apneic probably is not the best option to put them in a spontaneous mode if they have frequent periods of apnea. So here's my pressure tracing. And again, what's terminating that breath is the inspiratory flow falling down to a preset threshold. Trigger the patient on. Either the breath starts because of the pressure drop within the circuitry or an inspiratory flow is inspired. Rises to my target pressure, stays there until the inspiratory flow falls down to whatever that percentage of the peak flow is. Got a general understanding of pressure support. A little bit of a boost to the tidal volume, okay? How much pressure? I determine it. If I want 10, 10 it is. Every time they trigger that breath, airway pressure would be boosted by 10 centimeters of water. Alternatively, there's something called tube compensation or automatic tube compensation. Now, this is basically exactly the same thing, except the ventilator is determining how much pressure to apply. Okay? I don't set the amount of boost that I'm going to give. The ventilator, using our friend Pousset's law, says what I need to tell the ventilator is what size endotracheal, or what's the inner diameter of the tube, and I'm going to tell it if it's an ET or a trach. So I know length and I know diameter. What's the other components of Pousset's law? Viscosity? That's not going to change on a breath-by-breath basis. You end up having flow. And what was the other one?
Radius?
Well, that's a diameter, right? If I know what the diameter is, I know what the radius is. Flow and pressure. The ventilator knows when the breath is triggered on how much flow is coming out of it. So I tell it the diameter and I tell it the relative length of the tube. Is it an endotracheal tube or a trach tube? It measures the inspiratory flow and automatically applies the exact pressure required to overcome the resistance of that tube. Every 5 milliseconds, which I don't know what the hell that is, right? It's 1/1000th of a second. It's updating itself. In the amount of time it takes you to blink your eyes, it's updated itself 6 times. That's pretty damn fast, right? So what it does is it alters the pressure support level to just match the inspiratory resistance. If the patient changes their inspiratory flow rate, it changes the amount of pressure required. Because higher flows will require a higher pressure to overcome that. So ideally, if we wanted to wean somebody or put them on a spontaneous trial, you could put them on tube compensation and just see where they're at. So here I have a pressure level that's being generated for that inspiratory flow rate. And again, this is being done throughout the breath. It's altering this pressure level. If the patient wants more breath, wants a deeper breath, because remember, it's a pressure-based breath, they can take whatever volume and flow they want. At a higher flow, it kicks the pressure up to overcome that. So it's matching the patient during the breath on a breath-by-breath basis. That's way cool.
And the patient's still triggering this.
Patient is still triggered on, yes. It's a spontaneous breath, meaning they're going to start it and they're going to end it. It's just a fancy way to apply pressure support, where this algorithm does it automatically. So usually what we do is, this is not so much a specific order, but it's a protocol. So every morning, if the patient, we evaluate whether the patient's ready to be liberated from the ventilator. We used to call it weaning. We don't really wean patients off over a prolonged period of time. We say, hey, Stacy, you ready to come off the ventilator today? And she says yes. I'll say, okay. We flip it over to tube compensation, a spontaneous mode, and we watch her breathe. And if she breathes okay for 5 minutes, cool. Watch her for an hour, cool. Watch her for 2 hours, cool. If everything's okay, we extubate the patient. Okay, it's not something where we gradually take the ventilator support away. Sink or swim.
How long do you normally monitor the patient before you determine?
Couple hours.
It's actually about 30 minutes, depending on the patient's condition. As far as our place, we have 30 minutes.
It depends what put them on too. If they're a cabbage,
Right. We have like you do a 3-minute protocol where you're putting them on tube compensation and a CPAP of 5, and do the RSPT and all that, your NEF and your slow vital cap, all within 3 minutes. Then you put them on a pressure support of 5, a PEEP of 5 for 30 minutes, and if all goes well within that 30 minutes, you draw blood gas, show the doc, and if everything is resolved and all of the weaning parameters have been met, you can actually pull the tube at that point, if everything is good at that point.
you will know within the first 3 minutes
Yeah.
whether or not they're going to make it or not. Oh yeah, yeah. You'll see accessory muscle usage. You'll see the dysynchronous ventilation, where their abdomen's going in during the inspiratory phase, and they get that seesaw breathing. Their respiratory rate kicks up, their heart rate kicks up. Not going to work today. And then,
Or you might come back in 3-4 hours and try again. We've had several of those
Right.
in that places, kinds of stuff like that. Usually within the first couple of minutes,
okay. But the assumption with tube compensation is that all the problem with worker breathing is associated with the endotracheal tube. That could be a little bit of a fallacy, because people could have air resistance over and above that, or compliance problems over and above that. It's just saying this is what the tube's component is, how much the tube is applying it. I think Mary goes through more in the fall on tube compensation. Let's take 5. Okay, so those are spontaneous breaths, supported or unsupported. Use of tube compensation, use of pressure support, or not. Patient starts, patient ends. Mandatory breaths are different. Mandatory, the ventilator's in charge. Okay? It can be started by the patient. It can be triggered through flow or pressure to start the breath, but the machine is what's going to determine the ending point. There's 3 primary types of mandatory breaths that can happen. We're going to call them controlled, assist control, and intermittent mandatory ventilation, or IMV. Okay? This is how the ventilator interacts with the patient, not what goes on during the breath, not what type of mandatory breath it is. It's just that it's a mandatory mode. And I'll explain more about that in a second. Actually, I'll explain it now. So I can have a volume-oriented breath in the control mode, or a pressure-oriented breath In the assist control mode, I can have a volume or pressure, or actually the dual we talked about. In an SIMV, I can have the three of them also. Control mode is where the patient cannot do anything. They are locked out. The ventilator determines the rate, the flow, everything else. Patient, tough rocks. Obviously, we would only do this pharmacologically. So if I paralyze somebody, I am controlling them. In the old days, we used to have the mechanism where we could truly lock out a patient. How cruel. You want the breath? I don't think you want the breath.
What situation would you really want to do that in, like, where we want?
We would pharmacologically control with analgesia and sedatives along with a paralytic for patients that are fighting the ventilator, where the attempt to ventilate, they're just so desynchronous that we're just going to take over. Put them in a coma and manage them that way. And that's what the next slide shows you. Okay. Just ahead of ourselves. Sometimes patients with seizures, patients with flail chest, really severe, where the paradoxical chest movements is just causing too much issues. Bad asthmatics, sometimes we'll do that with. So again, the breath that is being delivered, is it pressure-oriented or volume-oriented, doesn't matter. Okay. Again, it's a mandatory breath, no spontaneous. So can I have somebody in controlled ventilation with pressure support? No, because there's no spontaneous breaths. How is it triggered? Well, it's triggered by the machine. It's time triggered. What starts the breath is the respiratory rate control saying, hey, it's 5 seconds has gone by at a rate of 12. Time for a breath. What ends it is dependent upon how the ventilator is set up. In a pressure-based breath, I'm going to set an inspiratory pressure and an inspiratory time, and what ends the breath is time. In a volume-based breath, I'm going to set up a volume and a flow rate that's going to be delivered, and when that volume is delivered, it's going to cycle itself off. Key part is whenever you have somebody who you are controlling. You got to make sure those alarms are set appropriately, because an accidental disconnect will mean death. Kind of important. The most common type of ventilation is one that we're going to use called assist control. It also is called CMV, continuous mandatory ventilation, on some ventilators, but it's basically the same thing. This is where I have that backup rate that we set in the control mode, where I set my respiratory rate is equal to 12, and every 5 seconds it'll deliver a breath if the patient doesn't trigger prior to that point in time. If the patient triggers prior to that 5 seconds being elapsed, they get that full mandatory breath each and every time they trigger the breath on. So they may be breathing at a rate of 20. 20 times a minute then, that mandatory breath will be delivered. Does that make sense? Is that the coffee pot? I thought there was some mouse in the wall or something. What that mandatory breath is can be a volume-based breath, the same volume each and every breath, a pressure-based breath, the same pressure being applied for a certain inspiratory time, or that dual controlled type breath, where it's going to look at the breath that was delivered and say, do I want to alter the pressure level to get to my targeted tidal volume? How am I doing? Thank you, Stacy, for summarizing. Arlene.
So if the patient triggers a breath before that 5 seconds and like 4 seconds,
Mm-hmm.
so it takes a few seconds for them to do the process, like inspiration and expiration.
Mm-hmm.
So the mandatory breath will be,
It just resets the timer and looks for the next five seconds to start up. But otherwise, it's going to continue to deliver every time it senses the patient wanting a breath by them triggering it on, delivers the mandatory breath each and every time.
Now, depending on volume or pressure, like, you might not achieve that volume. They might, if it's pressure controlled, are they gonna achieve that tidal volume?
If we're truly in a pressure-based breath, pressure-controlled breath, volume will be variable, not guaranteed. And it'll basically, what we're hoping is that if it's too small of a volume, because perhaps their compliance fell or the resistance rose, that the alarm will trip and say, hey, buddy, you got the wrong, you don't have enough tidal volume there.
But if it's volume, they will get, the machine will give it that full tidal volume.
It will give that full tidal volume at whatever pressure it requires. So remember, a pressure-oriented breath or a volume-oriented breath, which one's better? It depends. They're both good and they're both bad. It depends upon the therapist knowing that too much pressure is a bad thing. Too little volume is a bad thing. Too big of volume is a bad thing. You got to set your alarms appropriately. Okay. So again, looking at the kind of how this assist control is set up, there is a control variable, pressure-based, volume-based, or dual-based. No spontaneous ventilation. It's turned on by the machine or it's turned on by the patient. Or technically, I guess, it's turned on by the therapist at the bedside, pushing the manual breath button. Any of them are possible. Depending upon what the control variable is, will dictate what the cycling variable is. Pressure will always have a time-cycled mechanism. Volume will always have a volume. And then we can set baseline pressure and FiO2 as need be. So here's my controlled breath where there was no trigger. Time elapsed, gave him a breath. Here the patient triggered prior to that time happening. How do I know it's an assisted breath? It's a drop in negative pressure below baseline. It's the patient turning it on. It's that IPBB mechanism where the pressure pulled back and created an inspiratory phase.
You said pressure control is always time cycled,
Yes,
and then volume control is always volume cycled?
volume cycled. I'm going to say that now. I'm going to regret saying it, but that's okay.
Oh, should I not write that down then?
That's okay. If you were to walk into an ICU and ask them how that ventilator is cycled, it's volume cycled. Yeah, but it's really, truly time cycled. And why that occurs, you don't need to worry about. We'll talk about it another day. Usually we're putting them in assist control when I need full ventilatory support. I want to give the patient a rest. They just got intubated because of a massive respiratory failure associated with a huge pneumonia causing increased work of breathing on the part of the patient. I just want to unload them. I want to give them a rest. Put them in assist control. There's a minimum number of breaths that they're going to get per minute. If they want more, they can get more mandatory breaths. The only real work that the patient has to generate is the work to trigger. And it is a nominal amount of work in most cases, or should be. Just a little sip is all you need to turn the ventilator on. Now, we're setting, typically in volume-based ventilation, this parameter, and we have a minimum number of respiratory breaths that will occur, so we can determine the minute ventilation that is present. The patient, though, can kick this respiratory rate up, especially if they're in pain, and create a respiratory alkalosis. Because every time they trigger, they're getting a full mandatory breath. So if they're anxious, whatever, you can create a respiratory alkalosis inadvertently. Same way, in COPD patients, if my rate's too high, In volume-based ventilation and in pressure-based ventilation, I'm fixing the inspiratory time. If I go from a frequency of 12 to a frequency of 20, and I have 1 second inspiratory time, here I have a 4-second expiratory time. Here I have a 2-second expiratory time. That could be problematic. Going back to that concept of time constants, if I'm not allowing enough time for them to exhale, they're going to air trap. Does that make sense? Yeah. I did those calculations in my head, and I don't know if I made sense. Total cycle time here is 5 seconds. Total cycle time here is 3 seconds. Right? Just so you don't, I'm not just pulling numbers out of the top of my skull. So it's good because it's taking full support, but there's nuances you got to be careful of. You can get to a point where basically you're over-ventilating them, and that could be, you know, a bad thing. Assist control. In many cases, because we're kind of a volume-oriented culture, most respiratory therapists learned volume ventilation, that volume-oriented breath. So when they would say assist control, they would mean assist control, volume control. Got to be careful there. Because I can have assist control, volume control. I can have assist control, pressure control, where it's a pressure-oriented breath. Or I can have assist control where I have the mechanism being a dual mode, like PRVC. Okay, so it really depends upon what we want to accomplish, the process. So here's the order. Assist control of 14, tidal volume of 800, 100%, 5 a peep. Walk up to my ventilator and find the assist control mode or the CMV mode. Plug in a tidal volume of 800. I'm in volume-based ventilation. That's how I know that. Set my rate to 14, my FiO2. You know what? That should be this way, shouldn't it? Fraction is always expressed as a decimal. Shame on me. Set my PEEP level to 5. In volume-based ventilation, we're going to go ahead and set a flow pattern and a peak flow rate. We'll talk about that later. Set my sensitivity to wherever I want. Set my apnea parameters. Once I got my patient hooked up, set my alarms. Bitchin'. Your final evaluation will be this. Only I won't give you these. You'll determine them.
Based on blood gas?
No, based upon a patient height and gender. You'll determine the ideal body weight and the minute ventilation needs. Sure you will. Whatever you say, Rick. Those flow patterns that we can set can either be a square wave flow pattern where the inspiratory flow is fixed, or can be a decelerating ramp. In both cases, I'm determining the inspiratory time. Yes, it does, because it'll alter how that gas is being delivered. Typically, I will tell you in assist control, volume control, we're using this pattern. And we'll talk more about that later. Older ones actually had a sine wave. You and I breathe on a sine wave where we start off with a very slow inspiratory flow, go to a peak flow, and then slowly go back down. They said, hey, if people do that naturally, maybe the ventilator should do that. Dumb idea.
Why?
Flow demands. Patients like to have a lot of flow right up front. None of you have been on a ventilator, right? Ever?
No, but I think I need to be to understand this. I think I need to be.
Teresa, I got a better idea. And I encourage you all to do this. Take a filter, put yourself on. Take a filter mouthpiece, go ahead and put yourself on the ventilator. And feel what it's like to have that gas being delivered. Most patients, remember, when I'm setting flow, that means I'm in a volume-oriented breath, because flow and volume go together. Flow is just the integral of the volume that's being delivered, right? Volume per unit time. When I'm setting that peak flow, I'm setting the maximum flow, because I'm volume, volume-based breath, flow is the limited variable. Flow is what I'm controlling. So what ends up happening is I end up having a fixed flow rate being delivered. Anyone who's been on a ventilator will tell you that it's uncomfortable as hell in volume-based ventilation because the flow just doesn't seem like it's coming fast enough. I'm being denied getting gas. Because of that, that's why the dual modes were so attractive. In dual mode, it's a pressure-based breath. Flow is variable. You want more flow? Take more flow. And from a standpoint, when I used to sell ventilators and teach, I used to grab physicians and put them on ventilators, just that way. Feel this. Now feel this. And to a person, they all said, holy shit, it's a lot easier to ventilate in that pressure-based breath. Now, did they change their practice? No. But it feels a whole lot different. So your patients got a lot more comfort because they can draw whatever flow they want. I'm not limiting it. Okay? There's a hell of a lot of scribbles on that screen. Oh well. Technically, there is something called the assist mode. We never use it. Why would you not have a backup, right? You did assist when you were doing IPPB. We didn't set a timer. Other than that, we'll ignore it. Okay, the last group is something called SIMV. In an SIMV, there's some mandatory breath, and there's some spontaneous breath. Some things where the ventilator is guaranteeing a certain number of breaths per minute. Everything else is made up by the patient. So there's some portion. Where'd I go here? There we go. There's some portion of this minute ventilation that is mandatory, and there's some that is spontaneous. Make sense? I have somebody on SIMV of 10. What does that mean? 10 times a minute they're getting a mandatory breath. That mandatory breath can be volume-oriented, pressure-oriented, or dual controlled. But 10 times a minute they're getting a fixed number of breaths. If they go apneic, they get 10 breaths per minute. They can, though, in between that 10 breaths, take spontaneous breaths however they want. And those spontaneous breaths can be supported with tube compensation or pressure support or unsupported. Okay? But the key part to remember is that there's some portion of the minute ventilation made up by the patient, some portion made up by the machine. Got to distinguish between the two. We used to have something just called IMV, intermittent mandatory ventilation, and it basically said, every 10 or on a rate of 10, every 6 seconds, I'm going to give you a mandatory breath. Well, with the patients taking spontaneous breaths in between those, and what would happen if the patient was trying to exhale and the ventilator said, "Oh, here's your breath." You get a little bit of a conflict there. So they said, you know what, let's figure out a mechanism by which I can synchronize that mandatory breath with a patient effort. So in the old days, time for a breath, time for a breath, time for a breath. Wait a minute, I'm exhaling. Now what it does is it says, oh, he wants a breath. He's taking a spontaneous effort. Let me synchronize my mandatory breath with you. Yeah. Well, this was what they ended up calling, in the old days, this is where they would end up getting breath stacking. You're trying to exhale and the ventilator says, screw you, I'm delivering the breath. Not a very pleasant feeling. So we really don't use this anymore, but it just kind of historically that would end up happening. So again, going back to my methodology for determining what's going on, I figure out if it's a pressure-based or volume-based or dual-based breath. Those mandatory breaths, what are they? Spontaneous breaths, are they supported or unsupported? Is it time triggered? That respiratory rate, that backup rate that's there, is it patient triggered through flow triggering or pressure triggering? Or am I standing at the bedside doing the triggering for you? Same mechanism as far as what's turning it off. And we know about baseline and FiO2. Oh, I always hate teaching this part. Let me just put it into a simple mechanism. Let's say I was at a rate of, I'm on a rate of 15, so that means that every 4 seconds there's a breath that occurs. The ventilator is a little bit classy in the way it does this. Under what logic would tell you is that when 4 seconds has elapsed, it's going to go ahead and deliver a mandatory breath, right? But what it does is it takes, well, you know what? Let's look a little bit before that 4 seconds and a little bit after the 4 seconds. So if it sees a patient trigger at 3.9 seconds, it'll go ahead and assume that that's close enough. If it goes past the 4 seconds and it sees a trigger at 4.1 second, it'll go ahead and deliver the breaths in synchrony with them. So it's got a little bit of a window that it has around that 4 seconds.
How big would that window be?
It depends upon the respiratory rate. La 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 la. The point being is that somebody who's on an SIMV of 14 may actually have a respiratory rate of 15, and they're all mandatory breaths because it's got that window in there. It's got a little bit of fudge. Okay? And what it's attempting to do is synchronize as best as possible. And that's what these next few slides show. I would never ask you this. All I want you to understand is that there's a built-in window that is there. So it's going to go a little bit before, a little bit after. And I'm going to skip right through there and go to this slide. Okay?
Yep.
All right, so we talked about there's a portion of the spontaneous, of the minute ventilation made up of spontaneous breaths and a portion made up of mandatory breath. So we need to separate them off. Graphically, here's what we would look like. This is a volume-oriented breath. Patient triggers that mandatory breath on. This is a mandatory breath. This is a mandatory breath. How do I know the volume is the same each and every breath? So there also is a spontaneous breath that is interspersed in there. So I have SIMV, volume control, with no pressure support. How do I know that? When the patient inspires, it doesn't rise in pressure. It doesn't have a delta that's built in there.
But I thought you said it kind of like makes up for, like if the ventilator notices that they're trying to take a breath, they count that as part of the cycle, then why would
That would be a mandatory breath. That would be one of these two. It noticed that the patient had a trigger, and it was time for a mandatory breath, so it gave a mandatory breath.
So if it's not time for a mandatory breath, but it does recognize that
It just allows a spontaneous breath to happen.
okay.
It allows those spontaneous breaths to occur interspersed between the mandatory breath. Is their brain soggy yet?
Did you say you could use pressure support with that too?
I sure could.
So what would it
I could take this, okay. this pressure tracing, so, no.
Now, if you did, would it be the same as AC? This is
No,
That only needs a trigger.
what's gonna happen when I trigger this breath on in a pressure supported breath? What's gonna happen to airway pressure? It'll increase to what? Whatever my pressure support level is. So if I have this guy on 5 of pressure support, this pressure is going to rise up to a level of 10, starting at 5, going up 5 to a pressure of 10. How long does it stay there? Until the inspiratory flow drops down to 25% of the peak. So that would be SIMV volume control with PSV of 5. Oh, it'll all make sense. I promise.
So it will achieve with SIMV, VC, or PSV, it'll achieve that tidal volume. You just don't know how long it'll take because you're only giving a certain amount of pressure, right?
It'll attain a tidal volume, not a fixed tidal volume. It's a pressure-based breath. It's going to be a variable volume.
But volume control. So
These breaths are volume controlled. They're mandatory breaths. But these spontaneous breaths are part of the patient. If I have pressure support on, it's going to be a bigger tidal volume than if I don't have it on. So here I have, again, a pressure-supported breath. How do I know it's pressure-supported? Because the spontaneous trigger occurs and it rises to a target pressure. I know sometimes looking at graphs are tough to know what's going on. Is the volume the same on these breaths? So that must means it's a volume-controlled breath. I don't like the way that they have this drawn. I would have had a different amount of tidal volume showing that these spontaneous, yeah. But I know that they're pressure-supported breaths. In most cases, you'll probably get a pretty close tidal volume each time it does, because compliance and resistance aren't changing on a breath-by-breath basis typically. Over time, though. Yeah, not in that short time frame. How do I know it's also volume control? I'm fixing the inspiratory flow rate. I know I'm throwing around a lot of information here. Bear with me. We'll walk through it in the lab one by one. So I'm going to have you set up each of these different modes, and you can see how it differs. Okay, so this is what the order would look like in SIMV. SIMV of 14, tidal volume of 800, FiO2 of 50%, PEEP of 5, pressure support 10. So SIMV, volume control with PSV. MOUSE. Set my tidal volume, set my mode, set my rate, my fractional concentration of oxygen, PEEP level. Because we're in volume-based ventilation, we're going to set a flow pattern, and I'm going to set my pressure support level. Set my trigger, set my apnea parameters, adjust my alarms. Bitchin'. Now there's 2 different labs that are there, and I don't know the page number because that's probably not correct. But lab 9 is going to go through each of the 3 ventilators and allowing you to go ahead and get a feel for where various things are on the screen, how to make changes, where do settings go, where do alarm settings go, okay? We'll break at 11:30 and come back at whatever, 12:45. When we come back, I'm going to talk a little bit about pressure-based ventilation again, pressure control ventilation. And there's also a second lab that is in there. I believe it's lab 10, or lab 12 maybe it is, whatever. But it's one where you have various settings that you have to plug into each of the 3 ventilators. So the first lab, you just kind of get oriented to the screens that are present. We've already went through how to do self-checks on them. Now let's talk about how each of them differ and where you find, how do I set the high pressure alarm? Well, it's probably under the alarm settings screen. So how do you navigate to that point in time? And then the second part of that is, how do I plug in settings? The PEs for each of those three, you will have fixed settings that we will tell you, I want you to place this patient on these settings. Once you get them set up, get your alarm set, get your apnea parameters set, you'll say, Rick, Nancy, come over and check me off. We'll come over, take a look at it, and then we'll say, put them in a spontaneous mode with pressure support, with tube compensation, with nothing. It's going to change all of your alarm parameters. You got to reset everything, and then you'll call us back over again. Does that make sense? If not, tough rocks. We'll walk you through it. But for each of those three ventilators, we'll end up doing it.
And it's page 152.
It's 152.
Where it starts.
This introduction.
Yeah.
152. There you go. Lindsay.
What about for the PEs? I mean, can we only do the PEs on a Wednesday or a Friday, or are you here like during the week?
I will tell you my schedule is typically I'm here on Wednesday, I'm here on Friday, and I'm usually around on Thursday. I'm usually here till about 5. Can't guarantee it. So your best bet is to drop me an email and let me know if you're planning on coming up here to get them done. Okay. I will tell you that there is a lot of lab time built into the last few weeks, so it should not be an issue for people getting them done. We haven't had that problem occur. On Friday afternoon, I am gone until Tuesday night. Unless I got something holding me down here, I go to the cottage. All Friday.
What about Nancy? What's her schedule? Do you know?
She's here on Wednesdays and Fridays. She is not here on Thursdays. And you would need to make arrangements with her if she's available. And I don't know what hours she has. So. But I try to get out of town.
Literally or?
Literally.